Well, hello there, John Meyer here. It's Friday and I release a new video every Friday. This is the 7th Friday in a row, which may not come as much of a surprise to you, but it's a very big surprise to me. So please go watch the previous videos, especially last week where I introduced a plugin, a free plugin that you can get on my website called BASS.IC. It's a synth plugin. And this week I'm going to write a track using only that plugin. So let's go take a look. I'm about halfway through the process and I want to show you the individual tracks before I print them into audio to manipulate further. That's the way I like to work, and I'll show you how I do that after this. Every track features BASS.IC, and I'm going to show you how I approached each one in the order that I wrote the track. Okay, so we have the very first, I just called it Spacey Pad. I wanted something to give me some chordal structure. You can see it sounds like this. Notice the mod wheel is attached to the low pass filter. I did that on purpose because I love it opening and closing and treating it dynamically with the low pass filter as opposed to just a volume expression. It's the way I like for the plugin to perform. Notice that it opens up as we go. I do have this long space echo setting going on with short delays on each, but with a long feedback. So here it is without it. I'm also running it through a significant amount of Hall reverb, which is this vintage Valhalla on the return, about 4 seconds of decay. Also notice every time I can, unless I really need it, I'm going to roll off the bottom end of delays, of reverbs. So I've got that at 630 hertz, so nothing below that is passing. There's so much low frequency information that I don't want to mess with it. Now, this is all going to transition into the mix phase, but I like to write with it the way that I'm going to hear it in the end. Notice the same thing here. My low cut is up fairly high. I don't know what frequency that is. I just continue to raise it until I feel like I've got to the point where it needs to be. Also notice I've got the flanger on the actual basic, and I've got some resonance up as well and some drives. I'm using some of the built-in effects. Now, my goal with this was to have a very simple plugin with different waveforms that I could choose from, and then do my manipulation after the fact with plugins that I know well and I know how to get the result. But this was the first thing that I made. Now, keep in mind, oftentimes I don't use the first track that I write. Sometimes it's there to get me started, but it ends up taking too much space because, for instance, I am playing some pretty thick chords here, and as you add more notes, they're going to get in the way. So we'll see how that translates to the end. But that's where I'm at now. Now we have the reason why I made the plugin in the first place, our simple sub bass. And for this one, here it is. Extremely exciting. It looks like I've got my low pass filter set. I did not print any modulation, or I did not print the low pass filter because I never moved it. I wanted it to be consistent and solid the entire time. And I'm using the sub and some of the sine, and that's just what I thought sounded good here. The sub is from my JU06, the little boutique Roland, which is a great little device, but if that's the sound I want, often it just made sense to go ahead and put it in a plugin that I could use all the time. All right, so now those two together, it comes in on the second time through, which is precisely why I cut off a lot of the low frequencies in the sound, in the delay, in the reverb, so that this bass can somewhat stand alone. Now we have a track that I have muted because the timing is really messed up, and the reason why I'm not stressing over it is because I'm going to print this into audio and then manipulate it quite a bit, I think. And so I'm not going to waste my time trying to get things to line up in MIDI when sometimes, whether it's a user error or Pro Tools or the plugins that I'm using, it's just easier for me to visually line it up after I'm done with writing the part in MIDI. So here's the part without the plugins. So here's what I have. It's very similar to the Spacey Pad. Drives all the way up, my filter mod wheel here. I'm making some adjustments and building it as we go. You can see this kind of the first time through, the second time through, the third time through, and then a quieter outro. And I'm just using the sub. But then I added duck to give it that rhythmic pulse. But duck is the thing that's kind of making it not sound right in the mix. And so, but the fact that those are chopped up like that, it's going to be very easy to manipulate and switch around in the audio format, which is the way I prefer to work if I possibly can. Then I have some decapitator. Notice the low cut is way up there. It's a little darker, and I'm driving it with what I assume is the Neve style. And then, of course, Echo Boy, the dotted delay, just to give it some rhythm. All right, now we move on. I'm calling this angry pad. And notice those three sounds are either frequency or rhythmically different from one another, as much as I can get this to sound different. Now we have what I'm calling angry pad. Let's mute these real quick. I've got everything engaged. Drive is all the way up. The flanger is up to give it that left-right movement. And then I have Alter Boy, which is fun. Let's skip over to the bigger section. A fairly common setting for me. Pitch all the way up, formant all the way up, drive up fairly high. Well, this is to taste. For this sound, I wanted it to be an angry pad, right? So you got to go for it. And then I adjust the wet-dry mix. So here, and then I recently purchased this Valhalla delay to try to break my Echo Boy addiction, but it's really cool for 50 bucks. You can't, all their plugins are 50 bucks, and then if money is an issue for you, save up and buy these plugins first, because they go a long, long way for 50 bucks. Broken tape verb. I'm just trying to make this as dirty as possible. See the drive and the age, the wow, flutter, they're way up, so it just gives this weird sound. Without it, I wanted a sound that could, another evolving sound, different from the rest, to add to the mess there. Now we have a pulse sound. Let's skip to where it's louder. So I adjusted these triangle waves to get somewhat of a different sound. Let's turn this off here. I have duck. So there's the sound without duck. So for this, I was going for that alarm, but not but just a very, something's not quite right here. With decapitator, drive way up high, I could punish it. I always think I want to punish things, but punish is aggressive. Have it darkened up. So right here you can hear more of that sub, but when you do the low cut, you hear more of that nasally sound with the drive, which I'm hoping I can make it a little bit quieter in the mix, but still cut through. Too much. All right. Now, one thing I will say at this point, all these are somewhat, it's a muddy mess, and I'm hoping that I can get into the mix process. Normally, I would not be this worried about how the mix is going to sound, because I would choose instruments that fit a little bit better. But the goal here is to use basic on everything, so it's going to be a little muddy in some parts. So I'm going to really have to go in and manipulate the low mids of each of these sounds to make them work, but we'll do that later. And so now the next sound I have is this low arpeggiated sound. Let's listen to it. So very much the Stranger Things vibe, right? And the mod, I'm using the mod wheel to open up the filter as we go. And notice I'm also changing with the chords, B minor. So now I just raise the F sharp to a G for a G chord with the B in the bass there. So what I've done here with this sound is I'm running it through this Slate VMR. Let me go ahead and mute this Altar Boy. I'm adding some top end to help it cut, and I'm also compressing it, which I don't think you notice it till here. I'm just barely tickling this to where somewhat slow attack and fast release to try to help it. I'm bringing the gain down as well, but to help it make me pop just a little more. And I've also got my low cut set on this Earth plugin. What it does for these lower sections, it adds a little more bottom end because I found a frequency that I liked, around 70 hertz. I'm making the Q more aggressive drop off with a slope of 12 dB per octave, and so it really helps to emphasize that low point. Now, that may be something I have to deal with when it comes to the bass, the sub bass track, because there's a lot of low frequency there, but I'd rather get the sound somewhat where I want it and then mess with that later. Now we have little Altar Boy. Same settings here. Just adding some of that top end, that harmonic information to help it cut through the mix ever so slightly. Now I have some stabs. Let's listen to them without. I wanted a sound that showed up and went away. Everything else I'm doing is very continuous, so I wanted a quick sound, despite the fact that the delay goes on forever. And that delay is coming partially from the hall here. Ah, I didn't mute this verb. Looks like I had more sounds here. Whatever, you'll figure it out. So, there it is. You can see that I have a slower attack and no release. A lot of drive. Couple that with VMR. See what I'm doing. Honestly, I may have copied this from the other track. It's compressed. And then we've got a little Altar Boy to add that high end information that does a little something weird. Followed by a super long 30-second hall. Why not? But also notice nothing below 470 hertz. All right, moving on to the last sound. When we got to that third section of the 4 sections, we needed one more element to help the track lift ever so slightly. So I have this high arpeggiated number here. It's playing a B minor the entire time. And side note, if you're in Pro Tools, I can't see because my light's in the way, but if you go up here and you go to Event Operations, Step Input, then you can, I'm set to 16th notes, I can easily and quickly write in a part. That's what I will often do instead of playing it in. Lots of ways to accomplish that, but that sometimes works for me, and that's what I did here. Without the processing, you have this. Sub and sine. I like the top end of that. It's not terribly, it's a little rounder sounding to me. The drive is up. The flanger is a really cool addition there to that sound. And then we add decapitator to darken up the tone ever so slightly. Low cut, high cut, drive. VMR probably copied over from, but it's hitting the compressor harder. It's just helping it snap. Little Altar Boy to get that octave. and then probably way too much reverb. We'll have to mess with that here in a minute. All right. Many of you have asked about how I take it from this process to the final mix and why I commit and what I commit. And let me walk through this with you. Basically, I want to commit everything that I know I'm happy with and maintain the ability to tweak other effects in the mix. So, for instance, with this Spacey Pad, I want to get rid of this. I'm happy with the sound. However, I may want to adjust what's in Echo Boy later. There are a dozen reasons why I would commit. One is just because, hey, if it sounds good, go with it. Also, in case I don't have certain plugins in the future and I have to recall this setting, that's one reason why I want to commit as much as possible. And then the other is I like to manipulate audio, especially for tracks that are arpeggiated in nature or whatever. I like to be able to go in and line them up or chop them up and move them around, and that makes more sense to me in audio than it does in MIDI. Now, I get it. There are some things you can only do in MIDI, like the modulation wheel controlling the filter. But everything after that, I like to have the opportunity to mess with that, especially when it comes to the transitions from section to section. It's easier for me to do reverses or to do some little chops. It's easier for me to do that in audio than it is in MIDI, and that's primarily why I like to do this. So for this track, the Spacey Pad, I'm going to commit up to this insert, and that means it's only going, and we crashed. So what I've done here is I've organized the session in a way that makes the most sense to me. Now, before, when I was showing you the instrument tracks, I was showing you the order in which I composed the track. But now I'm dividing them into groups that make sense for my stems down the line. Now, normally this is easier. Drums, bass, electric guitars, whatever. But these are all synthesizers, so I'm having to think through how I want to divide these up. I normally do drums and then bass and then guitar. So since I don't have drums, I'm just going to start with bass, and that's my sub bass. I gave it its own color. Then I have a pulse sound. The pulse could very well go with the arpeggiated sounds I have coming up, but I'm going to leave it on its own for now. So for example, I'll just show you what they sound like all together. And then I have my pads down here, and then the stab sound. I also could somewhat demonstrate why I like to make some edits in the audio or with WAV files as opposed to with MIDI. For example, these pulses, I've already done this, but after the fact I noticed that when they printed down, they were just slightly behind the beat. So I was able to nudge them ever so slightly and back towards the downbeat. There were also some issues with, I believe it was this track, which for one, you can see I muted most of it. However, if you look down here, I used elastic audio to lock the beginnings of the transients to the beat because they were slightly off. And then I made some tweaks here at the end of the track, and I copied a different section and I made somewhat of a rise here at the end. Listen to it. So none of that existed earlier on. So I took a section here, like for instance, the bass. I copied the bass to this last section and did a long fade out. And then I brought it back in at the end with a fade in. I did a similar thing with the pulse. I brought that in and dropped it way down using clip gain. I just wanted a little bit of that top end to shine through. And then I believe I made some volume adjustments throughout, like right here on the stab, I went back and drew in some volume. Okay, real quick, this is not a mixing tutorial, but I'm going to show you some things that I did. I love VMR because you load it in, it's one plugin, I know how to get the sounds that I want fairly quickly. So for this pulse, I'm cutting as much low end as I can out, and then dropping some low mids. Things get real muddy with all these mid ranges in the synth. One thing, look at the bass compared to, say, the low arp. I'm rolling off quite a bit of the bottom end, so it's letting the sub bass really shine through. And then also, I did some automation to this low arp right here, to where, if you notice right there, if you notice right here, my high pass filter is at 100 because there's no bass, there's no sub bass. But now in this B section, I raised up that high pass so it allows the bass to speak clearer. And then I made some adjustments throughout in different places. I made some adjustments here on this high arpeggio. Boosted the top end, a big cut at 300. There's no need for anything in that sound to make it into my mix under 300 hertz. This was a very, very loud sound, this very first sound that I made. And so I used the virtual channel to bring the input way down, but leave the output the same. That way, when I'm hitting the plugins after it, they're in pretty, it's not overdriving. I also had some stereo width. This basic plugin from Pro Tools. I mean, just ever so slightly opening it up. Really nothing special. And notice what I do here with my effects, sends, and returns. I have a plate, I have a room, really short room here, and then I have a somewhat really long haul for synth stuff like this. You know, you can boost it more than it doesn't have to sound natural. Then I have a plate, and these are things that I kind of start with. It's a very, very minimal return setup. And then I put room, plate, and hall on each one, and I just go through and adjust tracks to taste. So you can pause it and look at how much I put where. Again, not a mixing tutorial. I didn't really think of a way to end the video with the headphones on, so I'll go ahead and end it now. If you liked anything that I said, please hit the like button or smash it if that's what you're into. I think I'm supposed to say that. Hit subscribe, and I think I'm supposed to end the video like this. Buddy, I'm trying to record some stuff, okay?
I know this is milk soaking. I'm going to put some new milk in it.
Update it?
Yeah.